a third of Americans actually believe that a second civil war will happen within the next 5 years.
We are as close to a cultural civil war as we have been since the 1860s. You have people very deeply divided. They have literally live in two different realities.
The U.S. Civil War has the highest American casualty count of any conflict. Somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000 Americans lost their lives during the 4-year battle between each other. And we're about to be there again. An October 2019 poll by Georgetown University found that Americans believe that the United States is 2/3 of the way to another civil war. This civil war is not North versus South like the nation saw in the 1860s. It's an ideological civil war. Liberals versus conservatives, maybe even rural America versus urban America, a culture war. People have had differing political views since the dawn of government, but in America today, it's causing issues bigger than we've ever seen in modern history. And there will be casualties.
Our streets! Our streets! Our streets! Our streets!
There are many factors contributing to the brink of the Second American Civil War, and we're going to examine them on this episode of Learn Something. Firstly, we have to discuss the recent protests that have definitely accelerated matters with respect to a civil war. Amidst a global pandemic and the fears surrounding the spread of the novel coronavirus in 2020, a nationwide movement was sparked once again by the death of a young black male by the name of George Floyd at the hands of a Minneapolis police officer. The organization known as Black Lives Matter became a household name.
Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter.
And thousands of citizens in major cities across the United States took to the streets in protest. But many did far more than protest. Minneapolis, Atlanta, Seattle, Portland, Chicago, and many more American cities were being ravaged by violent anti-police protesters. The 3rd Police Precinct in Minneapolis was destroyed in a fire. CNN headquarters in Atlanta was invaded.
People are laughing, some people are videotaping.
I just threw something on fire, Chris, a firecracker.
Yep.
Something's on fire!
Nick, you all right?
You okay?
And it immediately became political. The right side of the aisle immediately condemned the violence and deemed it unjustified.
Everyone has a right to speak. You have a right to speak peaceably and exercise the First Amendment. What you don't have a right to do is engage in violence. What you don't have a right to do is loot stores. And the violence and the terrorism we're seeing across the country is unacceptable. It is wrong.
And the left side of the political spectrum saw it as marginalized America wanting to be heard.
I stand with you no matter what. And if they launch the tear gas against you, they are launching the tear gas against me.
The left chanted to defund the police.
Many are now demanding departments be defunded, dismantled, or outright abolished.
As the right sought to defend the police.
All Black lives do matter. He agrees with that sentiment. But what he doesn't agree with is an organization that chants pigs in a blanket, fry them like bacon about our police officers, our valiant heroes who are out on the street protecting us each and every day.
These protests are among the many things ripping America apart at its core. The nationwide nature of these protests turned the movement into a revolution. They argue that the United States was founded on racism and bigotry, and the entire system that the nation runs upon is rooted in discrimination and needs to be demolished.
If we're going to hold together, we have to make a decision. Either fundamentally the American system is good but flawed, and we need to work on the flaws within the system, or fundamentally the American system sucks and was rooted in slavery and bigotry, and we need to rip down the entire system.
For years now, left-wingers have been arguing to remove Confederate statues from cities. Today, statues of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson have fallen to the ground. "2020 America is starting to look a lot like the fall of the Roman Empire." In June, the Capitol Hill district of Seattle, Washington became an autonomous zone known as Chaz. In other words, a part of a major U.S. city seceded from the United States. If that doesn't say civil war, I don't know what does. Not only is this war causing destruction of property, the protesters are armed with guns.
Chaz has guns.
A group of 100 to 200 heavily armed Black Lives Matter activists marched on Stone Mountain, a Confederate monument in Georgia. On the other hand, heavily armed right-wing protesters made their way inside the Michigan state capitol to protest Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer's coronavirus lockdown order. From a 10,000-foot view, it looks as if the division is racial. I mean, we're talking about Black Lives Matter here. Clearly, this is about race. But the division is not racial. The Civil War is not black versus white. It's left versus right. The 1963 March on Washington was primarily black. But today, over 75% of the protesters are Caucasian. Most BLM activists are not black. And there are plenty of African American critics of the Black Lives Matter movement.
You would never see me walking down the road with a damn Black Lives Matter sign. Black Lives Matter, that was built on a lie.
So, contrary to popular belief, the divide at its core is not racial. Now, in an aside, there is some debate about whether or not the divide is left versus right or urban versus rural. These BLM protests largely occur in the biggest urban centers in the United States, and rural America was largely unaffected by the mass protests early in the summer. My argument is, what difference does it make? The New York Times has a very detailed electoral map from the 2016 presidential election. Areas colored in red primarily voted for Donald Trump, and areas colored in blue primarily voted for Hillary Clinton. Compare this map to a population density map of the United States. Clearly, the darker areas on the population density map correlate with the blue areas on the election map. Urban areas with a high population density vote for the Democrat, the left-wing candidate, almost without exception. That's why I say, left versus right, urban versus rural, doesn't matter. Same difference, same divide. George Floyd accelerated this political divide and made it come to blows. But he definitely wasn't the first person to do that. Before him came a name we've all come to know very well, Donald J. Trump. Trump is the most polarizing figure that America has seen in a long time. Most people are not indifferent about him. You either love him or you hate him. Most people these days cannot even entertain the notion of their side being wrong on anything. Trump himself thrives on this conflict and even instigates it on his Twitter feed.
Trump is just throwing gasoline on a fire here. And he's having fun watching the flames. And he's having fun watching these holier-than-thou leftist journalists react like their moral sensibilities have been forever rocked.
On the left-wing side, they think Donald Trump is a spawn of Satan himself and is a racist, homophobic demagogue who stole the election from Hillary Clinton and must be removed from office.
I warned America that this was a dangerous man, a would-be dictator. This was a man who has no conscience. This is a man that should never have been in the highest seat of the land.
The right-wing side, on the other hand, think that he is a savior to America, trying his best to make America great again, but cannot do so because of the left-wing hate.
But Trump is the bodyguard of Western civilization. Trump was elected to protect our families from the vengeful mob that seeks to destroy our way of life, our neighborhoods, schools, churches, and values.
The Democrat-controlled House of Representatives has already impeached Donald Trump.
Article 1 is adopted.
The streets of Washington, D.C. were filled with anti-Trump protesters on the day he was sworn into office. What's going to happen if he wins against Joe Biden in 2020? Will there be deaths? Will Democrats contest the election?
Joe Biden should not concede under any circumstances because I think this is going to drag out.
And what happens if Biden wins? Will there be deaths? Will Donald Trump contest the election?
I fear that if he loses the election in 2020, that there will never be a peaceful transition of power.
Trump has been very vocal about his problems with the mail-in voting practices that states are putting in place ahead of the election. He says that it's very insecure and most Republicans and his base agree with that sentiment.
Mail-in voting, where they mail indiscriminately millions and millions of ballots to people, you're never going to know who won the election. You can't have that. Mail-in voting is going to be catastrophic. It's going to make our country a laughingstock all over the world.
What is going to happen in the event he loses? He and his voters will think the election was stolen from him. Who knows what's going to happen? The only thing that everybody does know is that no matter what happens in November, is not going to be good.
The Hegelian dialectic is heavily at play in this great nation, and the whole world is watching. So who's behind all this deception that is happening in the streets of America today? The chaos?
Tonight, anger boiling over in cities across America.
I cannot breathe!
Violent protest, anarchy, and so on.
Done with people like you. I have your opinion.
I am not a Democrat nor a Republican, but I personally believe with all my heart that the left has a lot to do with this shameful trend that are transpiring in this great nation today. And the main ringleader of all these deceptions is no other than the papacy. Their plan is to gain control globally. They claim to have the solution to every nation's problem. And pretty soon, all the nations will look up to the papacy for their answer. FBI warns of increasing extremist threat to the 2020 election. The FBI is warning police nationwide to expect an increase in election-related threats and potentially violent attacks from domestic extremists. Urban unrest impacting more than an election. Republicans are questioning whether Democrats will run the nation as they have the cities. It's a legitimate gripe. Yet, there is a deeper and more frightening truth in play that Portland has revealed. Can any of this be stopped by anyone, short of martial troops and martial law? This is a serious crisis we're facing in society today. 2020 election may be held under martial law, warns Oregon Senator. The man says if the line is not drawn in the sand right now, America may be staring down the barrel of martial law in the middle of a presidential election. Who ever thought things like that would ever happen in America? Could it be Bush vs. Gore all over again? The most fully developed dystopian forecast in a recent published book by Lawrence Douglas, a professor at Amherst College, titled, Will He Go? Trump and the looming election meltdown in 2020. Nothing compelled Gore to concede. Gore's action reminds us of an essential truth. Our Constitution does not secure the peaceful transition of power, but rather presupposes it. You would think things like this only happen in other countries, but it's actually happening in the most powerful country in the world. Go figure that out. Pope Francis is the very first Jesuit pope ever, and he took an oath when he became a Jesuit. Let's see what that oath is, shall we? Jesuit extreme oath of induction. You have been taught to insidiously plant the seeds of jealousy and hatred between communities, provinces, states that were at peace, and incite them to deeds of blood, involving them in war with each other, and to create revolutions and civil war in countries that were independent and prosperous, cultivating the art of the sciences and enjoying the blessings of peace, to take sides with the combatant and to act secretly with your brother Jesuits who might be engaged on the other side, but openly opposed to that with which you might be connected, only that the church might be the gainer in the end. And the conditions fixed and the treaties for peace, and that the end justifies the means. Does this all sound like what's going on in America today? Jealousy and hatred between communities, warring against each other. Friends, a country that is divided against itself can easily be conquered. And this is exactly what the man of sin is doing. Now Pope Francis is telling the whole world, in order to restore peace and safety, they need to implement his common good agenda. Don't take my words for it, friends. Here it is. Catechism of the Catholic Church, 2188. In respecting religious liberty and common good of all, Christians should seek recognition of Sundays and the Church's holy days as legal holidays. He also states in his book titled Laudato Si in paragraph 237, the man says, Sunday, like the Jewish Sabbath, is meant to be a day which heals our relationships with God, with ourselves, with others, and with the world. Pope Francis also says that his common good agenda is also the same solution that must be used to defeat the coronavirus. He says, the wounds inflicted by the coronavirus crisis will only be healed if we put the common good first. He goes on to say, headline, Pope Francis, promote the common good to heal wounds of coronavirus crisis. The man says if society does not join together in seeking the common good during the pandemic, it will emerge worse off. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to really understand what's going on here. In the Hegelian dialectic model, you cause a problem and you come up with a solution at the expense of people's rights and liberties. Well, Pope Francis has been blowing his trumpet saying he has the solution to the world's problem can only mean one thing. That means he is the problem.
And Bill, it's good to have you with us. Let me ask you something. There's something called the Hegelian dialectic that I'm sure you're familiar with. The idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And there were people who used to say, well, after we get the communist whole system in place, it'll go away, it'll vanish. Has anybody ever tried that, or is that just another one of their lies?
Well, it keeps getting tried. It's the eternal bait and switch. It's heaven on earth without God. It seems like what's happening now is more or less a culmination of this teaching that Hegel had given. Hegel was a philosopher at the University of Berlin, and one of his students was Karl Marx. And Hegel said the state is God walking on earth. And the dialectic triangle is you start off with the status quo, you create a problem that is real bad, and then everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. So Karl Marx took this and says, how do you create a problem that's real bad? You send in agitators, agent provocateurs, provoking agents, community organizers, labor organizers. Their job is to identify groups with grievances, racially, economically, ethnicity, and you stir them into crisis and riots. And when it gets violent enough, everybody says, we need someone to come in and restore order. And that's when a mayor or a governor comes in and says, I'll restore order. I just need to take away your rights in the process.